see if you can follow this one.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Sometimes you just need a Tim White to help you through this stuff. Not that your host hasn't been following this story very closely, but it has some components to it that may or may not have the general public, meaning you, engaged. But sooner than later, you probably ought to. I think impeachment fatigue actually impacts our attention span for even the stuff that seems normally Rhode Island gritty. But having said that, it's worth really, following the bouncing ball on what has been a contentious week at the State House. Great to have you in. Thanks very much. In the meantime, I don't know what turn we're on right now. It'll be determined, Friday, as to whether we're having witnesses and what witnesses might or might not do. Headline here is all about that. It's all about the backdoor witness fight and some, I think, shenanigans from the majority leader feigning that he didn't have the votes. This guy's pretty cagey. Here's what the network had at midday.
For more than a week, senators have listened to the two sides make arguments for and against convicting the president. Now it's their turn to ask questions.
The questions alternate between the majority and minority sides for up to 8 hours during that session of the Senate.
Those questions will be submitted in writing over the next 2 days, time Republican leaders will use to try and close ranks against calling any new witnesses.
There have been a lot of discussions, but I have no idea how the votes are going to fall.
While a handful of Republicans have indicated they're open to new testimony, it'll take a total of 4 joining a vote with Democrats to make it happen.
It's an uphill fight, as I've always said. But the public is on our side, and truth, above all, is on our side.
Calls for new witnesses picked up steam when it was revealed that former National Security Advisor John Bolton writes in his upcoming book that President Trump conditioned aid to Ukraine on an investigation into Joe and Hunter Biden. President Trump tweeted overnight, "Why didn't John Bolton complain about this nonsense a long time ago?"
Here's the only conclusion I can come to, and it's a harsh one, and I feel very bad about it. He's a backstabber.
If new witnesses are allowed, Republicans want Hunter Biden to explain how he got a job on the board of a Ukrainian energy company. And at least one Democrat says he's okay with that.
I don't have a problem there because this is why we are where we are. Now, I think that he can clear himself.
Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats say Joe and Hunter Biden aren't relevant to the impeachment case.
Now look, I mean, all that, I love that he's a backstabber. I mean, there's no, that's the New York, Washington version of the bada bing here. I thought there was going to be like an answer. Like, this is harsh. Like Bolton did this, or Bolton does that, or guess what, no, he's just a backstabber. It's like, hey, come on, Rudy, really? Is that all you got? In fact, that's mostly what the defense has at this point. What I meant by cagey is the majority leader suggesting last night he had the whole media in a frenzy, didn't he? Doesn't have the votes to prevent witnesses. Oh, then the phones all across America start to ring from the base to the Republicans threatening their lives if they call for witnesses. Unfortunately, according to the polls, that is now only a 25% part of the population, because 75% in most of the polls, including Quinnipiac just the other night, want to see some witnesses. Here's the disappointing part. You're not going to see any, because even if they call witnesses, they're going to be in back doors in the chambers. And so I think this whole thing leaves you wanting. And before we get to tonight's real story, Tim White has been experiencing the impeachment case from an academic point of view, right?
Yeah.
You want to tell people about what you do in addition to your rather extensive day job?
I'm in the master's program at Roger Williams Law School. Happen to be in a constitutional law class right now this semester, and my professor Diana Hassel said, "Look, we've only had 3 impeachment trials in the history of this country." She said, "I feel obligated for us to talk about it." So we've been looking at the impeachment trial, or at least one class, from the perspective of the Constitution. And like many things, the Constitution is very vague. It's not a lot of ink is spilled on how to handle the impeachment, and so it leaves it up open very much to a political process, which is why we're seeing so much wrangling that we're seeing right now, because there's not a lot of framework around how to handle an impeachment from the constitutional perspective.
I would think, in fact, you know what? It's another network for us, perhaps, because we've had some constitutional scholars here from the various institutions, but I'd like to broaden my network there in this sense. Constitutional scholarship has never been tested like it has with this impeachment case. I mean, look at what the House did. They brought in 4 constitutional scholars, 3 of whom agreed about the impeachment veracity and the removal as being legitimate. One talked about the timing of it not being absolutely right, but that it was a legitimate query. Dershowitz made his stand the other day as if he was the king of Constitution, and finally had to admit during his dissertation that he has a very minority view on this. It puts constitutional...
Opposite from his view in the Clinton impeachment process, by the way.
Yeah,
so.
That's clear to you and clear to me, not clear to him. He finds a way to, it's almost, the definition of like is like the definition of his is with his whole discussion of that whole thing. But it puts these constitutional scholars and scholarship in a high test mode. It really, really, really... It's an academic gymnastics exercise.
It is, and it's because there's not a lot of framework within the Constitution. And one of the things I find fascinating is, even though Richard Nixon was not impeached, so when we talk about 3 impeachments, Richard Nixon isn't one of them, because even before it got out of the House Judiciary, he had resigned. But I do think there's a Nixon standard that's at play here in the Trump impeachments, and that is the evidentiary standard. U.S. versus Nixon went to the Supreme Court very quickly, but the main piece of that was what? It was the smoking gun, literally the section of Oval Office tapes where he okayed hush money to some of the people, some of the robbers at Watergate. That is a high standard of evidence that is hanging like a shadow over the impeachment proceedings here. And I think with the House...
Meaning they haven't reached it.
Or they're trying to reach it now, possibly, some would argue Bolton is that standard, which is why they're trying to get them in there. But we also have to remember that happened during the House proceedings of the impeachment with Nixon. We're already in the Senate. So there are two different avenues that are happening here. So it's been really tricky for lawmakers, and again, that's why we're seeing it as a political process. And I don't mean political as in partisan. I mean political as in the civics of politics that are at play here, because the Constitution doesn't give a lot of guidance.
I'm glad you mentioned that. All too often in the last 20 years, and certainly in the last few, the word political is automatically toxic by the receiver. It's not. Politics is the engine that runs this democracy, which is the greatest system in the world.
Yeah, it can have a pejorative sound to it.
It's not necessarily so. So, having had that terrific conversation, which could go all night, let's zip through some headlines. In fact, the headlines pick up in kind of the middle of the story. I'll let Tim backfill it with me in our next couple of segments. So, once upon a time last week, the Convention Center Authority said, you know what, we're not complying with what had been an edict from the executive director of the Joint Committee on Legislative Services on behalf of the House Speaker to the Auditor General who worked for the General Assembly to order an audit of the Convention Center Authority. They said no, because the JCLS, the entity that is the functioning body of the General Assembly, had not formally voted for it. Now, how did they come to that conclusion? Well, because Blake Filippi, the state minority leader, the rep who sits on that board as part of his official capacity, sued the Speaker over using his authority without consent or a vote. And Tim is the one who starts this story with the inquiry in the beginning. He'll explain that later, but that is an instrumental part of this. And then next headline, as soon as that happened, in the middle of it all, guess what? The Speaker of the House who started this thing said, you know what, Uncle, and he pulled the audit. Not because he doesn't think the Convention Center doesn't deserve an audit, he says, but because, he wanted to express some deference for the lawsuit, kind of admitting sort of that, yeah, I did this on my own, but I'm the chair and I can do that. Okay, so then, simultaneous almost, only a half a news cycle later, the Convention Center Authority doubled down on this and said, you know what, this has been so messy, we want to send this letter to the state police asking for an official investigation on it. So that was Friday. And the weekend rolls along, and all of a sudden we find that there's a dumpster dump. And there's rumor running around all over, from pundits to reporters to police, that and state reps that some material, maybe germane to this case, has been dumped in a dumpster. First of all, any dummy who dumps paperwork germane to any case in a dumpster belongs in a dumpster. You got to shred it, man. You don't dump it in a dumpster. But anyway, Johnny on the spot, literally, Johnny Villela, former journalist for Eyewitness News, races to the State House and gets a picture of that. You saw for the state police, you know, looking in that dumpster. And I think Tim did too, because who doesn't want to take a look at the dumpster? So anyway, or Johnny did at least. Okay, and so you get the dumpster dive. Then the cleanup of by the way, the cause of all of that reportedly is like a little water break in the JCLS office downstairs in the basement of the State House, which causes mold, reportedly. And so this was all about not documents, but stuff being moved out. Now, Mr. Filippi, who filed the original lawsuit, says, you know, wait a second, you're going to move files around? You're going to save files? What do you do with the files? Hey, are you stupid? I just sued you for not complying with consent of the board. You're doing this without consent of the board? So he gets upset about that, and he threatens yet more litigation. He got a letter from the JCLS executive director hours later to say, you know what, we're just moving the stuff around. It seems like that has tempered Mr. Filippi's concern here. In the meantime, I want to welcome the Providence Journal to the story, front page. As the state police begin the probe, they refer to the original problem in this thing, which is that the employees who had a tryst that began all of this, allegedly, reportedly, possibly, are coming to their perhaps employable end. Tim will help fill in on that. And then lastly, 5 dissident Democrats have penned off a press release that says, this is just too much. This is the straw that breaks the camel's back. We need to caucus, maybe temporarily in a phone booth, to see if we can upend the speaker. And so you've got 15 seconds to punctuate that. And then we'll talk about it after we put your package to actually explain this whole thing in real news form.
Well, I mean, my 15 seconds is just to applaud you on that amazing summary of a really complicated story. And it's a complicated story because of all the moving parts.
And we left the very, very beginning out. It is referenced in that Projo headline. And by the way, the sarcastic remark on the Projo is that they buried this story on page A7 on Saturday after the Friday Real News on the state police request from the Convention Authority. And then their op-ed piece, or I should say their editorial piece, was just embarrassing in the last couple of days on this, doing the speaker's bidding. That's my thought, not Tim's, but I will tell you, it's disgraceful. When we come back, we'll run Tim's story on it, consolidate it, and then we'll talk about where this thing might be going. Stay with us. So I think you might have got it, right? But if you didn't get it, this will help.
The Department of Administration, which manages state buildings, confirms they were contacted by the state police this morning, but declined to comment further.
Carpets being torn up. Filing cabinets moved into the hall. The basement office of the Joint Committee on Legislative Services, or JCLS, in shambles.
And they discovered it was a steam pipe that had burst and causing quite a bit of damage.
House spokesperson Larry Berman says they discovered the leak, which caused mold last week, but the emergency renovation drew an unusual amount of attention because of where it happened. JCLS, the General Assembly's administrative arm, controlled by House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello. That office has been in the news after convention center leaders asked the state police to investigate if Mattiello used it to target them with an audit as retaliation over a personnel investigation there involving his friend, James Demers.
All of their files, Tim, all of they were kept. Everything was moved next door. A lot of them are in boxes outside the hallway.
Target 12 was there Monday night as state police, acting on a tip that documents might be getting tossed, responded to the State House, but Berman says the timing is just coincidence and no documents were destroyed during the mitigation process.
They're free to look in the dumpster, and I think they already have, but they can see that it was just material that is related to the structural damage of the room.
The state police declined to comment, but our video showed the detective who responded last night left empty-handed. Their presence at the State House, however, shows there is an active investigation.
Yeah, so that settled that.
Right. That's why it's a story. Look, if they're dumping furniture and there's a mold thing, John Villela and Target 12, we're not there. We don't care. We care because the state police showed up at the State House at 9 o'clock at night. I think probably, my guess is when you ripped carpeting out of your house, Dan, the state police didn't show up to check it out. So as I said in the tag of that story, to us it was very telling as to where they are.
Right. And so you got this, but what we really probably didn't fill you in on, because we picked it up where we could fit all the headlines, is how this thing really may have started, and that is with the Human Resources Challenge at the Convention Center Authority.
Right. Yeah.
You started this story, by the way. This is a WPRI Target 12 initiated story, which is probably 2 weeks old now from its inception.
Yeah, 2.5, I think. Yep.
Yeah, and it was.
The story was there were 2 people at the convention center who are in the middle of a personnel investigation. They have since been placed on administrative leave, and it appears that they're on their way out. One of them happens to be a close friend of House Speaker Nick Mattiello, a former state police captain named James Demers, who runs security over there. So again, Target 12 wouldn't care necessarily about a personnel matter at the convention center. We cared because while all that was going on, all of a sudden this unusual performance audit came from the JCLS, which, as you pointed out in the first segment, the speaker chairs, and there were questions as to whether or not that was punitive. And we later discovered that by law, those audits can only happen with a majority vote at the JCLS. There are 5 members, 3 of them are House members, including the Speaker. There was never a vote.
Well, we could talk about the process part, and we will in the next segment, but what I think is interesting about this is that, you report something, as you always do, with the facts that you've assembled, and people can determine for themselves what the inference is. I am now certain that this is an official act on behalf of a political / personal relationship that the Speaker has with the former State Police Captain Demers, who heads up security, who got jammed up with this personnel issue. None of which I really want to get into. It has, I think it's pretty widely established that this is the typical office affair problem that is at stake. But I have on multiple sources information that has representatives of the Speaker visiting the convention center and asking him to quell this thing, or, quote, there'll be an enema delivered to the Convention Center Authority, which I find funny, because the Convention Center Authority is certainly not without its normal and sundry scrutiny, audit-wise, but has always been a place where political patronage exists. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost to be careful what you ask for. The Speaker threatening an audit of the Convention Center Authority might bounce back to him, because how many people has he put in there, right?
Yeah.
But that's really what's going to be at stake here, right? And that's what the state police is taking a look at. Is this audit order that was rescinded based on process opposition by Blake Filippi, the Republican, nefarious in its objective?
And that's what the Convention Center Authority asked the state police to look for in a letter. The state police
and they wouldn't do that unless they felt like that was likely. They wouldn't do that. And by the way, you know the politics of this.
The pronoun they meaning the state police. They wouldn't do
no,
that.
they the authority.
The
wouldn't
authority,
ask for it
yes.
if they didn't feel like they wanted the state police in their nest.
I would have disagreed if you were saying the state police, because they have been so far silent.
Yeah, they do their thing.
That's right.
Yeah, the authority's like, hey, could you investigate this? And they wouldn't put themselves out on that limb if they didn't feel secure in the idea that there was a muscle attempt inside the convention center.
Right. Well, and
I think
it also helped that it was burst into the public view. Right. That they wouldn't have written that letter.
They had the momentum.
That's a good way to put it. And I think that gave them the green light to write the letter to the state police, I'm sure, and a recommendation from their counsel or whatever it might be. By the way, just to end my thought on the state police, very minor, the colonel, Jim Manny, over there said that, look, I can just confirm that we got the letter. I'm not going to talk any further about it, but it gets back to that story and what you call the dumpster dive story. The state police arriving on scene told us that they're taking action on that letter. at this point.
Right.
So.
When we come back, what possibly could happen here? The politics of this now are in play. What's next? Stay with us.
You violate the statute by ordering the audit?
No, we always operate through the chairman, like every board across the country
We should
does.
point out you're the chairman.
I'm the chairman of the committee. I inquired of one person, and I was told that it was basically a personnel matter, and I had no other involvement with that.
Well, guess what? Operating through the chair is not necessarily as casual and nonchalant as the speaker suggested a newsmaker show ago.
That would be one of my more memorable moments on Newsmakers, and I've been doing that show for a very long time. Been at WPRI for almost 14 years now. And I think when I read him the law, which we talked about earlier in the show, you need a majority. There's a 5-committee vote. You need at least 3. It was very clear to me, or it felt that came as a surprise to him in that moment, and that he...
Surprised that you would ask, or surprised that he needed 3 votes?
The latter. That is how it felt to me in that moment. Well, and I'll tell you, but it makes sense, right? Because this is the way JCLS has always operated.
Right.
They haven't met, Dan, since 2012. I'm almost positive I have that right. So there are a lot of questions about, well, how many other things need a majority vote?
All of them.
Just about all of them, I would say. I mean, look, you can order pens and pencils through the JCLS for the General Assembly. They have a $48 million budget, by the way. You can do that, I'm sure, without a majority vote of the JCLS. But significant things.
No, I think the budget line item that guides that is what needs to be voted upon. The execution of the pencils.
The broader.
But that and even he who protests, Blake Filippi, in levying this lawsuit, I pointed out to him only yesterday that his very smart move to ask for, say, a consultant on the IGT Twin River thing, which the speaker acquiesced to. That too was probably a JCLS necessary move. And in other words, this is going to be maybe not the enema that the speaker thought he was delivering to the Convention Center Authority, possibly, but the refabrication of what the JCLS is supposed to do and how it operates, and maybe the transparency of the General Assembly will step up about 10 miles in this whole thing.
Well, we'll see. But
you don't think so? He's going to have to react to that. Look.
Well, hold on. We already see a bill in the state Senate. So whether this passes or not is almost not relevant. We are seeing increased scrutiny, whether that leads to increased transparency, to your point, and I hope it does. There's a Senate bill that is asking for an extra seat in the JCLS. So that would level the playing field. You'd have 3 House and 3 Senate.
And where does it break the tie? I mean, they'll deliberate that, but right. The Senate, by the way, this isn't Democrats and Republicans. This is Senate versus House.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
And I think that's what has really come to
We got to rock.
the
10
fore.
seconds.
Sure.
There's 5 dissident Democrats that want to call a caucus. The heat's on with the speaker right now.
Yeah, from all sides. Senate now, and then the progressive left, which he had
Republicans
before.
in the House,
The Republicans in the House. So yes, he's in the hot seat.
The speaker needs to keep his helmet on. Great work again by Target 12 starting all of this. Final word when we come back. While you may be checked out on impeachment, don't be checked out on what's going on in our own backyard. Pay attention to the story at the State House. It is more acute to your taxpayer dollars, and good government matters. We'll see if there's witnesses. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Good night.